It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Lekson, and I've only just chatted with him today or tonight, for that matter, for the first time. So this is all pretty much new to me. Archaeologist Stephen Lekson received his PhD from the University of New Mexico in 1988. He has held research, curatorial, or administrative positions at the University of Tennessee, Eastern New Mexico National Park Service. He said he worked for 10 years. Arizona State Museum in New Mexico, Chaco Canyon Archaeological Center, and the Museum of Natural History at the University of Colorado in Boulder, which is where Dr. Lekson currently lives. He directed more than 20 archaeological projects throughout the Southwest, was editor for 5 years of the Kiva, and since 2003 has been an archaeology magazine contributing editor. His publications include a dozen books, chapters in many edited volumes, and articles in journals and magazines. And his 3 most recent books are A History of the Ancient Southwest, published in 2009, The Chaco Meridian, 1,000 Years of Political and Religious Power in the Ancient Southwest, in 2015, and then A Study of Southwestern Archaeology in 2018. And he curated a dozen Colorado University museums exhibits before he retired in 2018. In his presentation this evening, he will discuss some, quote, possible, potential, probable, end quote, insights that some early Spanish colonial documents may have provided about the Southwest's deeper pre-colonial history. And he will examine these narratives in light of native accounts and archaeological data. Doctor, I hope I didn't embarrass you, but I would like to welcome you to the Third Thursday Food for Thought as our guest speaker. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. And hello from Boulder. I need to do some stuff here. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks good.
Hello to everybody in Tucson and your friends down there. Just for starters, I don't have a degree in history. I have no facility with Spanish. I can understand a bit today, and certainly not. I tried to read antique Spanish to no avail. And a lot of this is based on, well, on translations, or on, in one case, talking about Niño de Guzman, almost entirely in secondary sources. So I'm an archaeologist. I always thought archaeology should be in history, not in anthropology, and I'll rag on that in a minute. And I have written a little history, some ethnohistory and some straight up history, but that's not what I got paid to do most of the time. In the last, some of these things I was aware of for a while. In the last 10 years, I've been interested in some old colonial documents, some of which are quite well known, all of which are quite well known, that seem to agree with some of the things that I said archaeologically, which of course makes me very happy. And I'm discovering these things after I made my claims, my archaeological claims, and then I turn to these documents and go, oh yeah, there it is. At least in my opinion, there it is. So I'm going to have to walk you through what those claims are for this to make any sense. So we won't get to the colonial documents for a while. I'll allude to them. Starting off with Lewis Henry Morgan. The ancient history of North America, the native history of North America, got put into anthropology instead of history. And in the old world, archaeology would be in history. Certainly at this time in the 19th century, when Lewis Henry Morgan is inventing American anthropology. Morgan is the founder, not the father. The father's probably Boaz, but the founder, what I think, arguably, the founder of American anthropology. He had no use for archaeology. And he said that, you aren't going to learn archaeology, can go collect pots and stuff, But if you want to know what happened in the past, use the ethnological method, which is what do you know about Indians today? And then you sort of wiggle in on what simpler forms in the past might have given rise to those, to what we see today. Sort of like a linguist creating a proto-language. And Morgan was quite emphatic on ignoring colonial accounts. Morgan insisted that there was no Aztec empire, no Aztec cities, no Aztec this or that that was all just Spanish hyperbole that they were writing to impress the king back in Spain, that the conquistadors were writing reports back in. So he said, just ignore those colonial accounts. Of course, Morgan was very influential. He wasn't a professor, but his one, you call him student, was Adolf Bandelier, who bought all this stuff, including no Aztec empire. And Bandelier was very influential on Edgar Hewitt. He was the big fish in the small pond of New Mexico archaeology. So Morgan's reach is long. There are still people doing the ethnological method. If you want to see how it's done right, look at John Ware's Pueblo Social History that got published, I don't know, a decade ago, something like that. That Ware is, a great practitioner. I think the book, I've told John this, I think he's wrong, but it's a brilliant application of the ethnological method. It's not how most of us do it. Most of us get lazy. Instead of pretending like we're linguists and puzzling out simpler forms in the past, we just take chunks from what we think we know about the modern Pueblos, which is flawed, and just paste them on the past. We take stuff from the present, put it on the past. Like this is a Fred Caboti painting of a Rio Grande Pueblo. It looks like San Ildefonso, and just take stuff from the books that were written about that, the classic ethnographies, and paste it on Pueblo Bonito, which I think I will argue is dead wrong. That, of course, is not how time or history works. And you don't go from the present to the past, you go from the past to the present. And our jobs as archaeologists, I think, as historians, is to figure out what happened in the past. And then if you want to, you can try and connect it to the present or not. There's a lot of stuff that happened in the past that has very little connection to the present. I mean, archaeology is the study of hundreds of thousands of failed experiments, not failed in pejorative sense, but things that came and went, globally, talking globally. But that's what archaeology is all about, is looking at stuff that didn't survive, and then some things that did, but most didn't. So I say archaeology is history, and it is. It's the same logic with different data. There was a time in the 60s and 70s when people my age, archaeologists my age, convinced themselves that they were a science. They were test hypotheses, and they wore lab coats and all this stuff, and it was just mass delusion. It's crazy. We aren't testing hypotheses. We're making arguments from evidence, just like historians. Okay, so it's the same logic, and I've read enough historiography to feel fairly confident saying this, but just different kinds of evidence. And I'll be talking about evidence from context. By that I mean what was contemporary with something, what came after, what came before. Start triangulating on what it is you're worried about. And geography, which is specific to my arguments about the Southwest. And folklore, and by folklore I don't mean to be demeaning. There's a whole discipline of people that study folklore globally. All right, and it's certainly applicable in this case. So I don't mean to be demeaning native knowledge. Is there is a discipline for studying this stuff, and that's folklore and anthropology, of course. I'm trying to break away from anthropology. Use Chaco as an example, in part because it's easy and most people know about Chaco National Park, World Heritage Site up in northwest New Mexico, and it's World Heritage Site because there's 7 really big buildings out there, call them great houses. And that's what they were. They were houses for very special people. And a bunch of smaller buildings, that whole, other than Pueblo del Arroyo, the whole bottom register there, the whole bottom line, basically storage, warehouses, storage facilities. And, lots of other stuff in Chaco Canyon, but it is a national park and a World Heritage Site because of these 7 big buildings, like Bonito. The archaeology there is really clear that you have 2 classes of people at Chaco. You have normal people that live in the lower right, the commoners. I'm going to call them nobles and commoners. I'll explain that in a second. They live in what are unit pueblos, 5 little rooms in a kiva, 5 little rooms in a kiva. What you'll see in there are a line of these things about to the same scale as that picture of Pueblo Bonito, where you could take one of these little unit pueblos in the floor area, you compress it in the floor area, fit in a single room at Pueblo Bonito. And they're 1 story tall, and I'm sure people love them dearly as their homes, or maybe not, I don't know. But they weren't built with the investment of labor that the great houses were. So I'm saying that you have two classes of people. Other people, this was recognized in the 30s. This is the problem: is you got these two very different kinds of buildings that are contemporaneous in Chaco and in its region. And you have 7 of the big guys and hundreds of the little guys. People originally thought, well, they're 2 different ethnicities. And that's true. They're 2 different kinds of people, but they're nobles and commoners. They're a part of one social system with nobles and commoners. Where's that coming from? Well, context. If you look at North America, America north of Panama, at Chaco's time, almost every society that grew corn had nobles and commoners. You know, Cahokia in the Mississippi Valley, there's no question about it. You know, it's not just in Mexico. Yeah, of course, the post-classic civilizations in Mexico, they had nobles and commoners for 2,000 years before Chaco, anybody even thought of Chaco. But up north, even the more affluent hunters and gatherers like the Chumash in California and the Calusa in Florida, they had nobles and commoners. I mean, if you want to see a stratified society of nobles and commoners, read about the Calusa, and they didn't grow corn. When they wanted corn, they took their armies inland and stole the corn from somebody in the interior. It would be remarkable if Chaco didn't have nobles and commoners. Everybody else did. This is the context. What's going on at the same time. What is Chaco's world? It would be remarkable if Chaco didn't have nobles and commoners. And from the architecture, just from the archaeology, I think we know that they had nobles and commoners. I mean, that would be unambiguous anywhere else in the world except the Southwest. But yeah, you have elites and non-elites, and let's call them nobles and commoners because that's what everybody else calls them in these societies I'm talking about. Chaco is the capital of a region. That region is defined by outliers, well, small great houses. A small great house sounds like a contradiction in terms, but that's what they are. They're like you take the 20th or 50th of Pueblo Bonito and hoist it up in a giant helicopter and drop it out in the middle of a community of commoners, of unit pueblos. And these things have a suite of features that those of us, that are interested in these things, about 200 of them. And the other day I figured I'd probably seen about 100 of those 200. And not all of them have these features, but most of them do. With a great house surrounded by an earthen berm, a great kiva either near the great house or out in the community of unit pueblos, and then roads radiating out from the outlier, often pointing back to Chaco. And I say Chaco is the capital of this region. Well, yeah, capital in the sense that it was demonstrably larger and more complex, central. None of this would make any sense if you didn't have that center. And the people that study capitals cross-culturally, like Amos Rappaport, Chaco's on his list. I mean, people have no problem calling this place a capital, and I'll call it a city for too long. And again, people that study cities have no problem with this. The city doesn't have to be Manhattan, but it's a capital in relation to a region. If you didn't have the region around it, wouldn't be a capital. But you do have the region, and it's very clearly marked by all these little symbols. The squares and triangles and circles. Those are all the outliers, little great houses. They're not all contemporary, but then you have the road system, and the road system, with the rise of LiDAR, we're seeing more and more roads are linking back to Chaco. So it's pretty clearly the center of a region. So you have nobles and commoners, and you have a capital in the region, and that has nothing to do with pueblos. Pueblos don't have nobles and commoners, and pueblos don't have one pueblo telling the other pueblos what to do. It's anathema. It's just the whole idea of using modern pueblos or ethnographic pueblos to understand Chaco is off the board already. I mean, the whole structure of the thing is completely different. Doesn't mean that Chaco wasn't part of Pueblo history. Of course it was, and that the people there weren't ancestral to modern Pueblo. Most of them were, maybe not all. But what I'm trying to do is pull the rug out from under my friend John Ware with the ethnological method of looking at the present Pueblos and trying to glom that onto the past. It's not going to work. I mean, the archaeology is quite clear here, and this is all coming from the archaeology. This isn't coming from, it's coming from the archaeology that if you and I have described Chaco's structure, its region, its center, big houses, little houses, to archaeologists from anywhere else around the world, well, not anywhere else, but several European countries, several Latin American countries say, oh yeah, what you got there is a little city-state, which I will argue is what Chaco was. Okay, the other lament that I heard for years is no model from ethnography works for Chaco. My colleagues who are still invested in anthropology, would look at acephalous African chieftains or something from Polynesia, which is okay, and nothing wrong with that, but there's hard to draw a historical connection between some what was actually happening in Africa and what was happening in the Southwest. And so you get this notion that Chaco is some mystery, it's unique. Well, it shouldn't be unique. I mean, Chaco is really late in the prehistory of North America, in the prehistory, in the history of native North America. When Chaco shows up about 1000 AD, something like that, you already had cities and empires and different kinds of polities in Mesoamerica for 2000 years. Okay, they probably tried everything under the sun that worked with corn. And, Chaco is probably going to be something like that. It probably shouldn't be unique. I mean, that's an extreme claim. Lynn Sebastian is pretty smart. 20 years ago said, if we haven't found a box, and she meant a model for Chaco, we haven't looked at enough boxes. Okay. The box where we haven't looked for boxes is Mesoamerica. And that there's a long history there about the international border and whatever that, we don't look that direction. We look, look at acephalous chiefdoms in Africa, but we don't look south of the border. I started looking south of the border, and I was reading about the Aztec Empire. How is that structured? And what was the political and economic structure of that? And the Tarascans. And I realized that, this is barking up the wrong tree. Chaco wasn't an empire. Chaco was a little piddly city-state on the extreme frontier of the civilized world for Mesoamerica. But then my attention was directed by several people, mostly initially by Gerardo Gutierrez, a friend and a colleague here at the University of Colorado. He said, don't look at the Aztec Empire, look at what the Aztecs conquered in their empire. What was the actual local political and economic system? And Nahua, Altepetl, and actually I've heard that word said by a Nahua speaker. It doesn't sound anything like Altepetl, but that's the closest I can get. And this is where our colonial documents first come in. James Lockhart and a bunch of other people looked at the political structure as attested by early colonial documents, the political structure of these local polities. Because the Spanish didn't wipe out all the existing political structures. They were working. I mean, the taxes were being paid into Tenochtitlan. So the Spanish said, fine, keep doing that. We'll send you a priest or a soldier or something just to make sure you're doing it. So they just added another layer of bureaucracy on the existing bureaucracies. And what Lockhart did is he tried to strip that off and see what was the actual, native political system. And it's Altepetl. It's small city state. And these are his, not his criteria. He said, this is how these things work. You had nobles and commoners. That's a given. You always had nobles and commoners. Okay. But you had a half dozen noble families, each with their own palace in the capital, and rotating kingship, where if the king died, it didn't necessarily go to his son. And the king is our word, not their word. Didn't go to his son. The leadership of those 6 noble families would get together and go, okay, you guys have been doing this long enough. This family over here will run the show for a while. So no one family could become preeminent. It's shared leadership. It's the city and the countryside. You had a capital city where these guys had their palaces, and the countryside. It all worked together. And I'll show you that in a minute. But that's it's a classic city-state. It's an international form that you see in archaeology. Tribute and taxes go into the capital city, which, no surprises there, but that fits Chaco to a T, where, everything goes into Chaco and nothing comes back out. And the archaeological take on that usually is, everything goes into Chaco, nothing comes out. Must be ritual. Well, no, everything comes into the capital, nothing goes out. Must be taxes. Must be tribute. And the scale of these things, and this is coming off not so much Lockhart's work, but Mike Smith's work, that the capital cities of these small Aztec polities, the cities some of them were tiny. They're under 1,000 people. Some of them were larger. They were 10,000 people or whatever, but mostly they were like 3,000 to 5,000 people. That's Chaco size. Chaco's 2,500 people, something like that. And the polity, the region that they controlled, and then again, this is Mike Smith's work in Mesoamerica, was 30, 50,000 people, something like that. Well, that's the region I showed you. Probably the population there is 60 or 70,000. So, Chaco's, the scales are right. The scales are right. The geography is a little different. The Altepetls are much more compact than Chaco was, but in terms of a model from ethnography that fits Chaco, this fits like a glove, and it's part of Chaco's time, part of Chaco's place. There could, there's more than likely there's even historical connections if you could reconstruct those between the people in Chaco and what goes on down there. I'm not saying that somebody comes up from Mesoamerica and says we're going to have an Altepetl now, but when it's time to have a government in the Southwest, they have a model that they already know. And it works pretty well down south. So let's try this. Let's have six families and rotate the kingship and do all this stuff that an Altepetl does. This is a diagram that I took a diagram in a Lockhart's book and turned it into a pizza pie. But this capital city, the hexagons are the palaces, and the capital city, the little dots are commoners. The big hexagons are the palaces in the capital city, which again is like 3,000 people or something like that. And the smaller hexagons out there are the secondary nobility that are out in the countryside making sure that the taxes get paid, among other things. And this really fits Chaco quite well. The pie slices here is the tribute and taxes flow in from a portion of the countryside into one of the princely families. That you owe this guy tax, you don't owe everybody tax. And the princely families pull that when they have to wage a war or whatever, but by and large, it's the personal property of that princely house. That's Chaco. You got 7 great houses, and you got this capital city with it's got unit pueblos and commoners all over the place. And yeah, secondary nobility out in the countryside making the whole thing work. It works really well. So from the context, I think we got some facts to work with. This is from archaeology. The archaeology, just anywhere else, is not a problem that you got nobles and commoners. Okay, and it's hard for Chaco archaeologists to choke this down. But yeah, anywhere else in the world or in North America, you would see this as nobles and commoners just from the architecture. Capital region, that's pretty solid. That's pretty solid. And the structure of the Altepetls, from the context of Chaco's time and place from North America. Now, admittedly, the Aztecs are a few centuries later, but Space on Ancient Earth and a bunch of other people argue that basic city-state structure goes way back in Mesoamerica. Okay, now the geography, this is peculiar to the Southwest, and this is actually where the colonial documents were really fun. And we'll get to them. But about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I put forward the proposition that you had shifting capitals in the Southwest, where starts and these dates are all pretty good. First capital's at Chaco Canyon, and then it shifts north to Aztec Ruins, which is a national monument due north of Chaco, about 50 miles north. And then when the wheels come off at Aztec, 1275, 1280, and tens of thousands of people leave the Four Corners. I mean, the wheels really come off. The nobles, not everybody, but the nobles, which is a small group of people, move south to Pakimé. All these things are north-south of each other. We know that the north-south was intentional from Chaco to Aztec because they built a north-south road connecting the two. I mean, there's a monument on the land. You can see that, oh yeah, it runs due north. You could do this. I'm not going to get into this, but this is just a question of, it's not technically difficult at all. You just have to take time and have a reason to do it. They're not all in the same longitude because they couldn't do that, what they're doing. This is a pattern that would result if they move north with some care and then south with some care and then north with some care and south with some care. They'd all wind up lining up more or less. Okay, in the intervening years, last 30 years, it was brought to my attention that for every stage of the Paco system, and you probably all heard this stuff, basket maker 3, P1, P2, P3, P4, P5. For each one of those stages, you could make a really strong argument that the biggest, most interesting, and I can actually back that up, probably almost certainly the most important sites of each one of those periods is on that line. Starts off in basket maker 3 and P1 and P2 and P3 and P4 down at Pakimé. And I have a peculiar usage of P5, peculiar to myself, where Pakimé ends about 1450. After 1450, that's P5 for me. It's not how they use it on the Rio Grande, but P5, oddly enough, is Culiacan, which is on the coast of Sinaloa. And we will return to Culiacan. It looms large in the colonial documents. Culiacan is not a southwestern site. It's the northernmost city that the Spanish conquistadors said was a Mesoamerican. Well, they didn't call it Mesoamerican, but that they recognized as a city, like the ones in central Mexico. It shared in this Mixteca Pueblo style, its international style of the late post-classic, mid to late post-classic. And asked me in the Q&A why I didn't work down there. I never went to Culiacan because it's the capital of the Sinaloa cartel. And it seemed to me like possibly that was not a good place for a gringo who doesn't, with blonde hair at that point, who didn't speak Spanish, to be poking around people's cornfields. So for context, I think we got some facts to work with, or mainly from the archaeology. The geography, part of the geography, what happens, you have these shifting capitals. And, this may seem problematic, but it's what you call a fact. I mean, the biggest, most important, most interesting sites of each time period in the Pecos system is on that north-south line. That's not a coincidence. I mean, it's impossible that would be a coincidence. Okay, the last thing I'm going to look at is folklore, narratives. And again, I don't mean to be demeaning to folklore. This is something that archaeologists would use wherever they're working, if they have any brains at all, is what do people say about these places. Some of the folklore I'm going to talk about is being reported in these early Spanish documents. All right. Some of the folklore is coming from modern native people, from Pueblo people and Navajo people. I'll just very quickly, I will get to the documents in a minute. For Pueblo people, there's a story about White House that almost certainly relates to Chaco. And from Navajo, there's the Great Gambler that absolutely refers to, I mean, unambiguously refers to Chaco. The White House is a version from Yakima that's published, which pissed off the Yakima people quite a bit when it came in. That White House is in the north, and it was marvelous. It was wonderful. They list all the wonderful things that happened there, but people get power over people, which is the nobles and the commoners. You know, you had people that were nobles telling the commoners what to do, and that didn't seem right. So the people shrug it off and move south, and they go to Yakima, and it's a long story, but they go to, they're marching south out of Chaco, and they get to Yakima, and half of them build, stop and build Yakima. The other half keep going south, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But 4 days out, or 4 months, whatever things it force, they have a ceremony of forgetting. I mean, they look back at White House, Chaco, Aztec, whatever it was, and they say, we're going to forget this. We're never going to do this again, because it ended very badly, and we'll get into this in just a second, that really horrible stuff happened there, and we're going to forget it. But of course they didn't. I mean, but it's squirreled away. Not squirreled's the wrong word. It's archived away, and the people are supposed to know this story, and they'll bring it out when they need to use an example of maybe what not to do. We tried this a long time ago, and it really stank. During COVID, I did a lot of Zooms, and some Pueblo people were watching those Zooms. I started getting these interesting emails, because I do a version of what I just told you, only about Chaco. And one of the things I heard from three or four Rio Grande people, and this is a quote from one of them, says, we know all about Chaco. We don't talk about it because bad things happened out there in the story. Another Rio Grande Pueblo guy was much more detailed about, what the bad things were. And he ended, this is a quote, he said, we hate the place. I mean, those Pueblo people, Yakima said they had a ceremony forgetting. The Rio Grande Pueblos that I talked to, it's only a handful of people, really, a dozen people maybe, say that it was really a nasty, nasty, nasty place. You never want to do that again. Which brings us to the Navajo version, the Great Gambler. I just bumped into this guy. I could have used any number of sources for this, but this man, Wally Brown, Hustine Brown, has a series of videos that you might want to seek out, where he tells Navajo stories. And I will not attempt to say the Navajo words there, but we're talking about he who wins men at play. And white people call that the Great Gambler. And I was at a meeting with a Navajo guy one time. He said, Great Gambler, this Great Gambler you're talking about, he was our king. And he said, do you guys have a word for king? He said, no, but that's what he was. This historian, Wally Brown, talking about the Great Gambler, talks about how Great Gambler was not a Navajo, is not Pueblo. He and his people, because he has a bunch of people with him, are something different. Nobles. I mean, nobles are divine, or semi-divine. Something different. And he enslaves everybody. He enslaves Pueblo people, he enslaves Navajo people, and he makes them build a house. He makes them build palaces. He puts them to work. And they hate it. It's really rough. Mr. Brown, this is paraphrasing some of it. Well, not paraphrasing much of it. These are quotes. But he said the way he uses Anasazi is just those jerks at Chaco, the nobles at Chaco, were, this is a quote, a violent people whose economy was based on slavery, the people who worshiped the darkness and participated in human sacrifice. And, this jives with what I'm hearing from Pueblo people, that horrible things happened out there. So what happens? There's a class revolt. The Navajos rise up. They don't give the Pueblos credit for this, but Navajos rise up, and they get this guy, you get the great gambler and his people. And there's various versions. They cut their heads off or put them under rocks or whatever. But the version I like, which you've heard more often than not, is they turn him into an arrow, turn the great gambler into an arrow and shoot him straight back south where he came from. Out of here. You know, you get your walking papers. Okay. So from the folklore, you can patch together a narrative of class revolt, collapse of the city-state. From the archaeology, you can see there's a city-state. From geography, you can see that there's a dynamic where it moves. And the story about the great gambler being shot back into Mexico, you can see how that moves straight south back to Mexico, back to Pakimá, back that direction. Okay, what about the colonial accounts? All right. I'll get to the good stuff in a minute here. Just talk about the name of the place. Bernardo Miera Pacheco, who is a guy that should be on your radar, amazing guy in Colonial, New Mexico. He's an artist and a cartographer, an explorer, a soldier. There's a good biography about him. But on his maps in New Mexico, and he made several in the late 18th century, he says Chaco, where Chaco is, which is in Old Spanish. And again, I don't have any Spanish. I'm getting this out of dictionaries from people that do know Old Spanish. It means an open expanse, an undeveloped area, an open desert. And so that's Chaco. Alexander von Humboldt, who we'll come back to in a minute, about 20 years later, 30 years later, in his map, which is we're going to spend some time with, he has something sort of near where Chaco would be called Chacat, and I'm not sure at all whether he's meaning Chaco with that, because geographically it's misplaced on the map. Park Service will try and turn it into something local, and as we'll see from Austin Brown, it probably is. But they say, well, it might be, and I don't speak Navajo, Chaco Canyon or Sakai, white string of rocks. That's the Park Service take. They also mention Charco, Charco, which in modern Spanish means a pond. All right, now where's that coming from? Okay, it's interesting. Captain Anderson in 1864, in a military map, shows Canyon del Charco. All right, and I don't know where he's getting that from. I've actually put this out in front of a bunch of historians in Santa Fe and said, where did this guy get this information for this map? I mean, some of it's coming off of Army expeditions and that kind of stuff, but the content, the actual names of things like that, he's not getting from soldiers. He's talking to local people. Well, Charco, if you look at old dictionaries, and this is a dictionary from the early 18th century, Charco means the biggest city. A translation of that definition there is Charco is any large population, also called in a metaphorical sense, Charco. That's, so to say, Madrid is a gran Charco. Madrid is a great Charco, is a great place. That's sort of interesting. I can't trace that one back, but that's one that I'd like to find out where Captain Anderson got that word. But I kind of believe this guy, that he says Chaco comes from, Chaco Haja, something close to that, Chaco Haja, which means the place of weeping. Again, emphasizing the slavery at Chaco and the oppressiveness of the Chaco rulers, this place of weeping. And he's probably right. Okay, going back to this meridian stuff, which again, you may have a hard time believing this, but it's true. I mean, all these very important sites, I would say arguably the most important sites of each time period, are north-south of each other. And I have a hard time thinking that's a coincidence. I mean, again, you get this pattern if you move north and south with if north and south become important to you, and you move that direction with some care. And it's, it doesn't require fancy equipment. You can do it with a rock and a string, as long as you take your time. Okay. Gaspar Pérez de Villagrá was a gentleman who came up with Oñate when Oñate was going to colonize New Mexico, about 1600. And he wrote an account of that. And Villagrá was going to get him from Chaco to Pakimá. He wrote an account of that expedition called A History of New Mexico. And it's a long, heroic poem, which I tried to read in Spanish, and thank God it's been translated, because I was hopeless. I couldn't do much with it. But it's been, there's a couple different translations. And I read a number of studies that remarked on Villagra's book his poem. And people pretty much seem to agree that he was a rotten poet, but a really good historian. Okay, the poetry was not good, but the history all clicked. History made sense. And this is important. This is important. The people who study this stuff credit him as a historian. Okay, so he and Oñate and the whole passel of them are coming up the interior route, and they come by Paquimé. And they're there like a century and a half after the place was abandoned and deserted. So there's a whole lot more of it sticking up when they see it. And they go, oh, holy Moses, what is this? And they asked the local Indians, we don't know who the Indians were, probably not Tarahumara. They asked the local Indians, did you do this? And they said, no, we didn't do that, but we know the story. And Villagrá puts it in rhyming couplets and tells the story. And this is folklore. Folklore from a Spanish colonial document about the archaeology. And it has a real archaeology component to it. And this is a translation, not my translation. This is from one of the translations of this book. That two heroic brothers of high and noble kings descended, sons of a king, kin of the highest lineage, come out of the north. And not with thousands of people with their entourages. They got their soldiers, they got, their court people or whatever, their second cousins, whatever. They come out of the north towards Pakimé. And at Pakimé, they run into this large crone, this hag, this woman who tells us, stop. Okay, boys, stop. And there are two different columns, Brother A and Brother B. I think their names are actually in here, these brothers. I forget what they were. It says, stop. And they say, most certainly she bore a huge, enormous weight, almost in form a tortoise shell set upright of iron, massive and well molded. So she's got this huge iron rock that she's carrying. And she says, Brother A, I'm going to toss this rock, and where it lands, you're going to build a city. Brother B, keep going south. Again and again, we have these accounts of, okay, keep going south. Some of them stop here, some keep going south. All right, iron, that's interesting. Okay, this is being recorded in about 1600. And in the 1800s, mid-19th century, there's a couple of guys from the local town, the little town of Casas Grandes, nice little town just on the edge of the ruins, who are out there digging, looking for treasure or whatever. And they find a huge meteorite. And they say it's from a temple. We don't know what that means, but they say with quite certainty, Teodoro Alvarado is the name of the local guy whose name's tagged onto this. This thing is wrapped up in cloth, and it's a big one. It's 1.5 tons or 1.7 tons of meteorite. This is a very strong woman that was holding this thing. But it's in the ruins of Casas Grandes, and it certainly wasn't visible from the surface. So here's Villagrá hearing this, recording this folklore story about the giant iron rock that's going to be here, and then the city's going to be built there, and bam, there's an iron rock, and there's the city on top of it. I mean, this gives, okay, the part of this I like is that he's a good historian, and I accept that two kingly brothers from kings descended came out of the north. One of them founded the city. Not that there weren't people there before, of course there were, but that he turns it into a town, and while the other one keeps going. This is cool stuff. I mean, this is again folklore being recorded in a colonial document that actually is very unsubtle archaeology, a 1.5 tons of archaeology that links these things. Okay, next guy, Nuño de Guzman, who's actually long before. Oñate is about 1600, Guzman's about 1530. This is before Coronado, all right? And Guzman was a real goon, real thug, nasty guy, a rival of Cortez. And he winds up being the governor or something, I forget the actual title, but sort of northeast Mexico on the Gulf Coast. And he meets an Indian, and all the Spanish are looking for cities of gold in the north. And the Indian says, I know where those are. My father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather are all traders, and they went up to those places, went up to those cities, and I can take you there. And the guy's convincing enough that Guzman, who's the fellow on the horse on the upper left there, with his Indian allies, he's being a thug, puts together an army, which is very expensive, just on this guy's word, very expensive. He has backers, and he marches over to the west coast of Mexico, goes up and down the west coast, just being horrible, killing people and burning towns and stuff, until he gets to Culiacan, which again is as far north as these cities go. And his guide says, okay, from here we turn north. from Culiacan, which of course is going to take them right into the Sierra Madres. This is a copper canyon. I mean, this is serious mountains between Pakimé and Culiacan. But Guzman believes him, and for about a month or 6 weeks, he and his army go bashing into the mountains. And of course, he's got horses and carts and flocks and all that stuff, and they can't go through the mountains. A guy on foot could. And Tarahumara are famous for this. Like, go up and down straight lines over those mountains. But if he had gone north, and then stuff happens, he gets recalled to Mexico City and thrown in jail and all kinds of stuff. So he never makes it. But if he had made it to the north from Culiacan, he would have hit Pakimé, where the guy's father probably did trading. And if he'd gone further than that, he'd gone to Chaco, where the guy's great-grandfather probably did his trading. There's cities. Some of them aren't functioning anymore, but the Spanish want cities. There's the cities, Pakimé and Chaco, and stuff in between. Okay, so Culiacan, again, there's been a little archaeology down there. I myself did not go down there because El Chapo was in charge down there until they got him. But this drove Carl Sauer crazy. Carl Sauer was sort of the founder of historical geography, which I tend to see myself as a historical geographer more than anything else, out in Berkeley, who got interested in the routes from central Mexico to New Mexico in a book called Road to Cibola, and this is in the 30s. And Sauer actually gets mad at Guzman and says, why didn't he go up the coast like Coronado did 10 years later? And he would have made it if he went up the coast. And it's probably just as well that Guzman didn't make it to New Mexico, because he was a very unpleasant guy. But Guzman didn't make it, didn't go up the coast because his guide said, go north from here, go north from here. He was very emphatic about it. And Guzman is no fool. He's a nasty guy. He's no fool. He tried to go north because that's where the cities were. And he's right. That's where the cities were. Okay, now we got to get him from Paquimé down to Culiacan. Alexander von Humboldt, one of the last great Enlightenment figures. He's a Prussian. I think when he's doing all this, he's living in France or Switzerland. I don't remember. He's a famous guy. He's a naturalist. He's interested in geology and botany and history. You name it. It's the Enlightenment stuff, right? And nothing he wasn't interested in. He spent some time. He had his own money. He spent some time looking around northern South America, and about just before 1800. And he goes home by way of Mexico City. He comes from northern South America. He lands on the west coast of Mexico, goes inland to Mexico City, spends a year there, and then he goes on home. And he stops off in Virginia to see Tom Jefferson. He and Tom Jefferson were pen pals. But the year he spends in Mexico City at 1800, it's about it. He's there from 1803 to 1804. This is a very cosmopolitan town. I mean, this made Philadelphia, Philadelphia is our pride and joy. Philadelphia is a hick town compared to this at 1800. I mean, they had universities, they had institutes, they had, you name it. They had the Royal Institute of Mines. This is colonial because the Mexican War of Independence starts 10 years later, or 6 years later. So he gets open access, von Humboldt, full access to the Royal Institute of Mines, which is sort of like our USGS. That was the map archive. I won't try and say those words on the bottom, but they had this collection of maps at the Institute, of pre-Columbian maps, explorers maps, and military maps, and every map. They copy some of them and send them to Spain, but they had the originals there. And he spends a year. I mean, he's traveling around too and doing lots of other stuff. He spends a year hanging out with these guys, looking at these maps, compiling maps of Mexico, the Kingdom of New Spain, which is Mexico and New Mexico. He goes back to Europe and he publishes this stuff in various editions, half a dozen volumes. But the most important one for us is the Atlas of New Spain by Alexander von Humboldt, and then accompanying political essays on New Spain, which are mainly economic essays. And this has been translated, so both of them have been translated. The map, there's a number of maps that he did, but the star of the collection is his map of New Spain, from the Isthmus, on up to past New Mexico, into Colorado, and it's pretty darn accurate. The latitudes are all pretty good because that's pretty easy to figure a latitude. Longitudes are all over the place, all over the map, so to speak, because longitude is really hard to figure. And he's compiling stuff from a bunch of different sources and a bunch of different maps. He's got people leaning over his shoulder because he's a famous guy, and probably every savant in Mexico City is helping him out with this. But he does this map, and it's actually pretty good map. Again, better in the latitudes than it is on the longitudes. But this is the New Mexico part of it, the northern part of it, and you can identify all kinds of stuff here. Natural features, obviously the Rio Grande, but natural features in Colorado, the San Juan. I say von Humboldt and friends because I think this probably represents the consensus in Mexico City at 1800 of what was up here, from all the guys, all the smart guys in Mexico City. Okay, he has lots of information and callouts. I mean, you see all these little callouts, but of particular interest here is that below the San Juan and right opposite the Animas, it's labeled Rio de Animas, he says, the first home of the Aztecs after they left Aztlan in 1160, an uncertain tradition. Okay. That doesn't, it could be anything out there, but in that area, certainly the biggest and most impressive ruins are going to be Chaco. And again, that's kind of a fact. The second home of the Aztecs, he places at Casas Grandes, which is the Park Service unit south east of Phoenix with a big tin roof over it. The third and final home of the Aztecs is, this is unambiguous, is Casas Grandes or Pakimé. All right. Casas Grandes, the third and final home of the Aztecs. And then this is squirrely because it's actually with the second call out, but he says, home of the Aztecs, from which they passed through the Tarahumara country, the Sierra Madre, to Culiacan. And he's quite specific about this being Culiacan. So he's saying from Pakimé, from the southwest, I think Pakimé, I would argue from Pakimé, that they go south, he doesn't know it's due south. I mean, these longitudes are all over the place. He didn't know it's south. He knows that they go over the mountains and to Culiacan, which turns out, we know now, since we do longitude pretty well, that it's due south of Pakimé, which is sort of exactly what Guzman's guys were telling him, that if you go north, you're going to hit a city. So you got Villagrá, having guys come from Chaco to found Pakimé when they bump into the lady with the meteor. Humboldt saying that, they leave there and they go south to Culiacan. And Guzman, centuries earlier, validating all that by his actions. Guzman, I'm relying almost entirely on secondary sources, because the primary sources are mostly legal documents from when he gets in trouble later. And there's whole layers of trying to understand that stuff. But it's pretty clear from Guzman that he was going north from Culiacan, which is exactly what Humboldt says the Aztecs are going south from Pakimé to Culiacan. So noble kings descended, colonial documents in the ancient Southwest. I mean, these things make me happy in my old age. I came up with the Chaco Meridian stuff, like I said, 30 years ago now. I didn't get published until 25 years ago. And then came up with the Culiacan connection. I actually mentioned it in the first edition of that book. I said, this is interesting. If you keep going south, you get the Culiacan, and maybe that's just a coincidence. This kind of stuff makes me think that it's not a coincidence. That if you're on foot and you know what you're doing and you're willing to take some time and it's important to you, you can go north-south and do it. And Culiacan isn't due south of Pakimé. It's like 10 kilometers off, right? But that's not bad for naked eye shooting. Fundamentally, they're not on exactly the same line of longitude, but they are north-south of each other, and that's undeniable. I think I'll stop it there. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. Is that?
You're good.
Okay, well, I'll stop it there. There may be questions and answers, but probably everybody believes every word I said.
You have more time if you want to go on.
Well, let me see what else I got. Oh, well, old Aztec ruins. This is some other stuff that's popped up that the Park Service take on Aztec ruins, which I say is the second capital, is that everybody read Prescott's Conquest of Mexico in the late 19th century. And as the settlers are coming in from back east, and I used to say this too, that they brought that knowledge, because Prescott says that, those ruins in the Southwest are probably the home of the Aztecs. The Anglo settlers named the place Aztec. Well, the Spanish knew about those places long before the Anglos show up. There's Miera Pacheco again on a couple of his maps. At the end of the Animas River, or where Aztec would be, he says there's fields fields of two rivers are capable of supporting very large towns, demonstrated by the ruins of ancient towns. And I don't know if Pacheco saw them himself, or it's just he's using maps, and the Spanish soldiers are going out there chasing after Utes and Navajo all the time. Another one of his maps says, here are discernible ruins of large settlement of ancient Indians. And in my flailing around on the web, when I'm not doing this seriously, I just was looking around for maps. And I saw from a map vendor, antique map vendor, a Mexican military map from the 1820s. That right where Aztec ruins, it says ruinous the Aztecs. And I've not been able to track that map down since. And I've asked all kinds of people in Santa Fe that should know, where is this Mexican military map from the 1820s? But yeah, I mean, people were calling those Aztec ruins long before. We don't have time for this. How much time have I got?
Another 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, here's one more use of colonial documents, and this really is at far removes, okay? Some of the details from those documents are important. But Coronado and De Soto, you got sort of context times two, and geography and folklore and colonial accounts. One of the questions that archaeologists are interested in, and other people are interested in, are Chaco and Cahokia. I mentioned Cahokia earlier on the Mississippi River. It's right across the river from St. Louis, and it's absolutely contemporary Chaco. I mean, it's exactly contemporary Chaco. But it's a real city. Cahokia is like, 30, 40,000 people. Probably much more than that, but that's, a safe estimate, 30, 40,000 people. And I said Chaco probably was 2,500, so it's, order of magnitude bigger. Biggest pyramid north of central Mexico, north of Teotihuacan. Biggest pyramid, because our Indians did it. It's north of the border. It's a mound, but it's a huge pyramid made of dirt. I mean, it's not made of rock, but there's not a lot of rock in the Mississippi floodplains. And it's it's contemporary with Chaco. Do they know about each other? And I don't have time to go into this, but there's actually some physical evidence at this point that they probably did. But you look at the colonial accounts, and you got Coronado showing up in 1540 or so. After Guzman's Entrada fails, and then Coronado comes in, goes up the coast like he should, and makes it to the southwest. And of course, he's following Indian guides. None of these conquistadors went anywhere without an Indian guide. You don't form a big army like Guzman did and not know where you're going. So yeah, he's got Indian guides, and his Indian guides, they lead him to Zuni, and bad stuff happens. And they go over the Rio Grande, and he works his way up the Rio Grande, pissing off Pueblos and doing his men misbehave, whatever. And Pueblos are going, you're looking for cities, our town isn't your city. What you want to do is go further up the river. There's a city up there. just get out of here. And eventually they push him all the way off to Pecos, which is as far north as Taos is further north. But yeah, that's the end of the Pueblo world before you get to the Great Plains. Next stop is Cahokia, actually. And at Pecos, he didn't like Pecos either. That's not made of gold. It's stone and brick and mud, whatever. And the Pecos guys say, yeah, we got it. We got a guy. We know that there are cities if you go further east across the Great Plains, because Pecos is sort of on the edge of the plains. And we got a guy that's probably a Wichita Indian. He's not Pueblo, who talks to Coronado and his people through translators and says, yeah, I can take you to where there's cities, and there's a river a league wide that has boats that have 300 men on them, and these are the huge dugout canoes that they had before they cut down all the big trees in the Mississippi. And Coronado goes out and he follows this guy. He believes him, because it's not just this one guy. And Pecos people were saying, oh yeah, I know there's cities over there. He follows him out in the plains, and we know his name, but the Spanish call him a Turk. This is just some. Yeah, okay. The Turk leads him. He's heading him down the Red River, and the timing on all this is iffy. But the Spanish think he's just leading them to their doom, because he's in the panhandle of Texas, and my God, and whoa, Oklahoma even worse. And so Coronado and his guys get mad and they kill him. They kill the Turk, And some other guides take over. There's a woman who says, "Oh no, you don't want to go down the Red River. You want to go to the northeast." Well, if they'd gone down the Red River, they probably would have hit the Natchez. In the modern town of Natchez is named after the Natchez Indians, who are the rag end of Cahokia. I mean, they have tiny little pyramids, but they definitely have kings, nobles, and the commoners. If they look at the king, they're dead. Yeah, if the king gets pissed off. It's a real city, and it has all this the big boats and all that sort of thing. When they decide they don't want to go to Natchez, their next guide, who I think is the woman, said, "Well, go this way." And if this reconstruction is correct, and there's lots of different versions of this, they would be heading towards Cahokia. Again, it's like Guzman being led to Chaco, which was gone, been empty for 2 centuries. But you want cities? I'll take you to a city. I'll take you to Cahokia. It doesn't function as a city now, but our visions of time are different than your visions of time. That doesn't work out either, and eventually they turn around and come back. So Spiro, keep your eye on Spiro. That's sort of the western outpost of Cahokia, and it's if the Southwest Pueblos were hanging in Chaco, for example, or hanging with anybody, to be probably going down the Canadian to Spiro. And there's plenty of evidence that Spiro, there's a cotton lace shirt, just like a Hohokam shirt, just like the Hohokam shirts. And there's one of those lace shirts at Chaco as well. I'm making this up, but it's not inaccurate. There's like 20,000 olivella shells in a big cache, and they're Pacific Coast olivellas. And those aren't things, the quantity, maybe 30,000, I don't know. But it's in quantities where you're not talking about olivella shell being traded down the line. I mean, this is bulk purchase stuff. And there's stuff back in Chaco and that comes from that part of the world. Okay, so keep your eye on Spiro, which I think possibly is where the Turk wanted to take him initially. Okay, at exactly the same time, you got De Soto, going through what they called Florida. He's in Florida, but he rampages all through the southeast, looking for cities, and he doesn't like what he sees, and he gets in fights and stuff. They get a big army. But the guys here say, guys at one city, he attacks the city and say, "You don't like this city, go further west. If you go west, you'll find cities." They finally get him to the Rio Grande, to the Mississippi River, and his guides, and he's got guides saying, "Yeah, you go across the Mississippi and head west and you'll hit cities." What do you get if you go across the Mississippi and you head west? You get to the southwest. He goes across the Parkin Mountains, and he almost, again, his route is better established than Coronado's, but it's still speculative. This is not my version. This is Charles Hudson's version. But he's going this way, and he almost makes it to Spiro, which probably was the meeting point between the two civilizations, between the Southwest and the Southeast. And he gets discouraged, and he turns back, and De Soto dies, and they crossing the Mississippi again. He dies of disease, but they tie some rocks on his feet, and dump him in the river. That's the end of him, and his survivors have a bad time, famously bad time. But if you look at this, Coronado goes through the Southwest, doesn't find the cities he wants, and all the people in the Southwest say, "If you go east, you'll find cities." And there were cities in the east. There's Cahokia, and there's Parkin, and there's Spiro. De Soto's coming from the east. He's coming from, Florida, working his way through the southeast. And his guides are saying, he doesn't like these thatched villages that he's finding. His guides say, boy, what you're describing here are these, stone buildings, all that kind of stuff. You want that? Go west. And they almost meet in the middle. Okay, so this is colonial documents, I think, telling us something. Yes, Chaco probably knew about Cahokia. And again, there's archaeological evidence that backs this up too. But that's, another, again, beyond tertiary use. I'm not using I'm using some of the primary documents here in translation, of course, especially about the Turk and Big Wichita and all that. So I think that might do it. So it's a sort of higher abstraction of using colonial documents.
Dr. Lekson, can you hear me? This is Butch.
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. Well, thank you. Well, as I guess I'm thinking we hoped for, it was excellent. before I ask Al to ask his question, let me remind people on the chat, or in the chat, there are sites, links to Old Pueblo bulletins, tours, how to donate, how to join. And although I didn't put it on there, there's actually an Old Pueblo YouTube channel for all of these programs as well. Al, would you like to ask your question first before we get into the others?
Yeah, sure. I was hoping it could be anonymous, but I'll ask them. Okay, for
You know,
one.
be kind. I'm doing you a favor.
Okay, yeah, you're right. Okay.
No,
You briefly showed a slide that showed Rio Navajo and from von Humboldt's map.
Yes,
And you didn't really say much about it. What are your comments on that?
that's the San Juan. Pretty sure that Rio de Navajo is the San Juan. That's its name in other Spanish documents. And then
Well, the reason I'm asking is, there is a place called Navajo in Sonora along the Rio Maya.
oh, no, this guy, I'm not sure if I have can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay, it's this one here. This is Animas. I mean, it says Rio Animas.
Okay.
So this is the San Juan meeting the Colorado.
Okay. So where's the Rio Navajo on there?
If it's on here at all, it'd be on the southern half of this. This is the northern half of this map. This goes down to, it doesn't quite get to El Paso. I mean, El Paso does, yeah, isn't on here. So it'd be on the southern half, which I don't have a blow up of that, but I can send you a link to a really good online version of this that you can, really.
But do you think it's south of this map excerpt that you're showing?
Yeah, well, what I'm showing is the north half of this map.
Uh-huh.
I'm showing you the north half of this, and I think, well, you can see it was folded in the original publication. So Sonora is going to be down, I don't know, down here somewhere. It might be on this map. But short answer is I don't know.
Okay.
But the Rio Navajo that I was talking about is the San Juan.
Okay. All right. My other question is, are the modern either Navajo or Pueblo accounts of human sacrifice in Chaco Canyon confirmed by archaeological research?
Fairly famously by Christy Turner. I mean, archaeologists didn't want to hear about it, but yeah, you have these episodes where, and this predates Chaco, it's after Chaco too, but where a whole village is rounded up and everybody's massacred and then chopped up into little pieces and thrown into a kiva or thrown into a pit or whatever. And there's not many of them, but they didn't have to do that very often. I think they're making a point. People that weren't paying their taxes or something like that, or just, people that are operating outside the lines.
Did you say that was pre-Chaco?
Well, there are episodes of that pre-Chaco, then during Chaco, yes, and especially during Aztec. When the capital moves to Aztec, the region shrinks. They get hit with a bunch of droughts. Yeah, everything falls apart, and it ends with a political decision for everybody to leave the Four Corners. Political decision, I think, by the commoners, but also by the nobles. And it's quite possible not all the nobles lived through that. I mean, there are stories of class revolts down in your country, in Oladam country, when people rise up and slay the elites, the nobles on top of the platform mounds. That's a class revolt. So it happens.
Okay, those were my two questions.
Okay, well, thank you. We have questions on both the chat and the Q&A, and I'll try to get to both of them. Here's from, I guess it's Dona or Donna Tang. Did you check out account by Alvar Nuez Cabeza de Vaca between Guzman and Coronado?
I've looked at de Vaca, but it didn't do a lot for me. He didn't really get, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong here. Isn't he one of the remainders from DeSoto? I'm asking that question. Yeah, he has a very interesting story that comes across the southern Southwest.
Oh, that was the route that Esteban was a member of the party, right?
Yeah.
And Esteban was later assigned to the Coronado expedition.
Yeah. But do you think he starts off with those guys? I'm not sure if I even addressed the question. No, I haven't done much with Dabaka's stuff.
Maybe if you didn't answer it totally, she'll probably get back to us, I guess. From Frank Grenier, I think, about half an hour ago. The stories of White House and Gambler reminds me of Autumn stories of Yellow Buzzard and the violent overthrow of the leadership
Yeah.
platform mound at, and I can't pronounce these two words.
So aquí, it's Pueblo Grande.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, might this be related to what happened at Chaco?
Oh, well, in my book it is, yeah. In the history of ancient Southwest, I tried the versions of the Odom stories that I've heard, and I don't know nearly as many Odom people as I know Pueblo people and Navajo people, but there are published accounts. Short Swift Time of Gods on Earth and Lynn Teague had a really nice article on this, where the stories are that there are people living on the platform mounds who are oppressive elites, and why not nobles? They're nobles, and they appear from somewhere, and they're not the local guides; they're foreigners, and that's an aspect of being a noble, is you're different than everybody else, even if you aren't. They show up about the time that Chaco's falling apart, and so you have all this unemployed nobility, and again, a few thousand people, something like that. Some of them, I think, head to Pakimé. Some of them might head down to the Phoenix Basin and set up shop. And they're great houses on top of the platform mounds. And they're not nice guys. They're oppressive. And after a while, putting up with this for a while, the people rise up, led by a culture hero. They rise up and they slay these guys, and it's like the French Revolution. They go to this platform mountain, chop his head off. They go to that platform mountain, chop his head off. And go to this other platform mountain, chop her head off. It's a class revolt, and I think this is my speculation. I have no way of. You'd have to do DNA or something. That those might be displaced nobility from off the plateau after Chaco. When I say Chaco, I mean Chaco and Aztec, that whole polity. After that falls apart in 1200s, because I think that's when it pops up on the platform mounds. Prior to that, I think God knows what's on the platform mounds, but it's not these oppressive nobles.
Well, I think there's more of a time difference between the two, though. Like, when was Aztec depopulated?
About 1300.
Okay, well, you're getting close.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, but it's probably at least 100 years difference. It's probably early 1400s when the revolt occurred.
Well, yeah, but that's when the Autumn revolt occurs. That means that those guys are in place for a while first. They don't revolt if those guys are there.
That's certainly possible, yeah.
And they have to be there long enough to be obnoxious.
Doctor, let me ask you this question from Joyce Clark. Do the Tarahumara have any stories that may be about Chaco?
That's a real good question, and I don't know. Our Tarahumara people I've met are not the kind of guys that would know those stories, I suspect. I've never heard any of the folks who work with Tarahumara, by that I mean anthropologists, even hint at anything like that. At Pakimé, they have signage in Spanish and English and Ramari, in Tarahumara language. But the Tarahumara people I've met who are Ramari say that's not us. We didn't do that. At least the ones I've met. There may be others who claim that they were part of that. No, it's a good question, and no, I don't know. I mean, it'd be really good to figure out who is living at Culiacan and ask them. But again, I'm a little shy about going down to Culiacan.
Yeah, I don't blame you. Well, so here's sort of a list of questions and answers, perhaps. I will begin with the earliest, which is from Anne Browdus, I hope. Any archaeological evidence of enslavement at Chaco or any of the outliers? And before you answer that, Donna has answered or has weighed in, but let's hear your answer as well.
There's pretty good evidence amongst some of the commoners on the La Plata River when they did a highway salvage excavation there. Completely spacing on the woman at UNLV, great osteologist who did, anyway, yeah, made a really good case that there were women who were buried like trash. I mean, people were buried in middens. It's not trash. I mean, it's it's a place where you put things that don't work anymore. But there were women who have been hit on the head repeatedly, and had squatting facets because they spent a lot of time grinding corn, who were just not buried at all. They were just thrown out. And Deb Martin, excuse me, that's who I was trying to think of. Deb Martin made a pretty strong case that those women were household slaves. I happen to be married to a woman who is obsessed by slavery, especially small-scale society, and she has done looked at literature from all around the world. Says that every society has slaves, almost every society, because almost every society gets engaged in warfare. The guys go out and raid. They bring back kids because you can train kids. They're useful after they grow up. And women, they're useful, and they kill. The men are useless. You bonk them on the head and leave them. So you bring women in, and we're not talking about kind of slavery that we had in the South or that Rome had, industrial scale slavery. This is household slavery, where you're bringing these women in to be drudge wives, to grind the corn. All right. And many unit pueblos, these are commoner houses. You'll have 5 or 6 rooms that, some of them are living rooms, maybe mostly storage. And then this thing we call a kiva out front. I'm gesturing and you can't see my gestures. You have 5 or 6 rooms and then a circular pit structure out front, which is probably where they're really living. And off to one side is a tiny little square pit structure, really deep, really nasty, with 3 or 4 mealing bins in the bottom. That would have been just horrible to work in. You see these pictures again. This is not the ethnological method. This is the sloppy transposing the present into the past. And in some of the modern pueblos, they would have rooms where they'd have a whole row of mealing bins built in. And supposedly the girls would go in there and grind corn for hours, and they'd sing and gossip and have a great time. And I'm not sure that any of the ethnologists talked to the girls about this. It's something that young women did. And if you do that long enough, it's a long process. You get facets on your bones, especially if you're young. You have to kneel and fold up your legs and kneel. And if you do that a lot, you get grinding facets on your bones. The women at Pueblo Bonito don't have grinding facets, but there are rooms at Pueblo Bonito that are nasty rooms. I mean, they would have been dark, they're interior, with a whole row of mealing bins, and I suspect they probably had people to do the mealing for them. Just on a cross-cultural perspective, that slavery is almost universal. I mean, why wouldn't they have slaves? Again, every society that Kathy studied in North America had slaves, but not like field hand slaves, not like the South. And then the formation of these grinding rooms. I mean, this is the onerous work of grinding corn, and maybe you can turn it into a ritual and feel good about doing it. But I suspect that the people who are grinding corn at Pueblo Bonito were not feeling good about it. So no, we don't have, they're not auction blocks. It's not that kind of thing. So, where you go out and raid and you bring back a small number of people. And then eventually, this works in the Southwest, or eventually in many, many places where these women that you bring back in wind up marrying into the family. I mean, this happens in a lot of northern New Mexico Hispanic families. Somewhere in there is a Comanche that they went out and got, and she turns into Tia Maria. And amongst Pueblos, and then amongst the Comanche side of it, they go steal some Pueblo women or Spanish women, and they wind up marrying into the family. So anyway, it's not like the South where you have a huge slave pens and all that stuff.
Thank you, Alan. I'm gonna. Can you see the Q&A? Does Donna Tang's answer or comment refer to the question before?
No, she's going back to the discussion of Cabeza de Vaca.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, which I don't know much about. I mean, I know those outlines, but
Yeah.
Okay. she's thinking of a different person than I am. She says Cabeza de Vaca was a ship off of Florida and made his way to Culiacan through the Southwest.
Yeah, I think he came off of the DeSoto expedition, didn't he?
Okay, yeah,
Or something like that.
but the shipwreck was actually on the Gulf Coast near Galveston.
Texas. Yeah, they found the ship.
Yeah.
Okay. I just went and saw it in Austin.
Thank you. I knew I was going to screw that one up. So, an anonymous attendee, what are the implications of Navajo accounts of heads, quote unquote, or no, heads rolling, quote unquote, at Chaco for the chronology of the Athabascan entry into the Southwest?
Well, we still, the archaeologists and historians still have the Athabascans showing up later, but the Navajo are so specific about this stuff, and they're so convinced that that's part of their heritage. They convinced me that I think they were either here earlier. I mean, one thing is, when did the Navajos arrive? Well, when we start seeing Navajo pottery. They didn't always make pottery. What did Navajo site look like before they started making pottery? Lithic scatter, I don't know. But they're so sure of this. And do I have time for an anecdote?
Sure.
Okay, the Great Gambler. I got the Navajos mad at me when I was doing NAGPRA. I got the Navajos mad at me because I wouldn't culturally affiliate them with the Four Corners Anasazi stuff, even though that's their word. For political reasons. I mean, we got the job done. We got the remains returned and reburied and all that stuff. And that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done it. But I was down Window Rock one time getting yelled at. And I know some of those guys down there from other events. And they said, look, I'm here all day. You got all day to convince me that you should be part of this whatever NAGPRA thing it was that I was doing. And just to cool off a little bit, I mean, they were very, as always, they're very polite, but they were pretty angry and pissed at me. And Tim Begay is one of the guys that runs their cultural preservation shop down there, good guy. So let's go take a walk. So we go walking around, and he takes me to the roundhouse and shows me some of the murals and stuff. Tells me the story of the Great Gambler, like I've never heard. Well, I was listening to it and hearing it again, and it jived with most of the other versions I've heard. And it's, and it's all in Chaco. He's all very specific. It happened this place in Chaco, that place in Chaco. And how would we not know that? How would we know that if we weren't there? It's a good point. And I listened to all this, and because of what was going on, I couldn't agree, but I, following it all the way, going, yeah, this guy's onto something. And then we got to walk, and I thought I changed the subject, and said, talking about all this gambling, how come you Navajo guys don't have casinos? You're kind of famously entrepreneurial. If it'll bring money into the nation, into the people, you're perfectly willing to do logging or whatever. How come you don't have casinos? All these pueblos have casinos, and some of them are rolling in loot, some of them are going bankrupt. But how come you aren't doing that? And he said the old people wouldn't let us. Oh, yeah, what's that mean? He said, the story I just told you. This is Tim Begay telling me. The story I just told you about the Great Gambler is very real. And that was so traumatic to our tribe, to our people, is on a par with the Long Walk. That was trauma. The Great Gambler was so traumatic that the old people will not let us have casinos. And I think probably there were some old elders in the tribal government that were, or the representative government that were standing in the way for that reason. That this is not a fairy tale. This is very real and very traumatic and very painful for those guys. And eventually, I guess the old guys died because now they have casinos. But they knew about it. It happened. I think it happened to them. And how the chronology is going to eventually work, I don't know. But they're so specific about it, and it's so intensely remembered by the folks I've talked to anyway, that I'm willing to credit that. Yeah, they know what happened out there, and it's pretty ugly. Which is what the Pueblo people say. They just aren't as talkative about it as the Navajo people are.
I think you have to consider too that probably a lot of Navajo have some Puebloan ancestry.
Sure.
Lines,
and vice versa. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, back when I was thinking about this before, got convinced they physically were there. They get these stories. They have Navajo people marrying into the family. Pueblo people marrying into the family. Some through this route that I was talking about before. A lot of both sides, Navajos and Pueblos, getting together. But the Navajos are living on the land out there. So they're growing up next to these ruins. And you're a kid and you say, Grandma, what's that? And she tells you the story and it's associated with that. When you talk to Pueblo people about these places, they may have those kinds of memories that's specific. And you don't talk about them. But mostly what I've heard out of like stories like White House is the principles, that people got uppity and there were people that had power of people. That's not how we live. We don't do that anymore. And not so much the specifics. The specifics are because the people are living right next to where these things happened. If that makes sense. It's like, what was the book about Apaches? Wisdom Sits in Places. That, these stories are associated with specific places, and the Navajos are the guys that live in it now, and they've lived there for centuries.
Doctor, we have a excuse me. We have a comment from Bill Gillespie to everyone, and Bill Gillespie is also a board member of Old Pueblo. I might note. Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban were survivors of the Narvaez
expedition.
Yeah, different expedition. Sorry.
No, actually, it's not. I was just looking at this on Google while you were talking. Yeah. And Cabeza de Vaca was shipwrecked off of Florida. Some of his party took ships and rafts farther west of the Mississippi, ended up near Galveston. And from there, Narvaez and Esteban and two other Spaniards walked across probably much of Texas and Sonora. It's debatable whether they actually got into continental United States, but all the way to Sonora.
Yeah, to Culiacan.
Right.
Where, as I recall, when they are approaching Culiacan, they're actually met by a bunch of Spanish slave raiders who are out looking for, Indians to capture for slaves. Mm-hmm. There's these bearded wild men from out of the woods who speak Spanish.
Here's a comment from the anonymous attendee. Steve, I believe you have come closest to picking the lock on Chaco more than any other scholar who has ever looked at the complex. But like David versus Goliath, you are up against the NPS, which has the clear monopoly on all public interpretation and comprehension of Chaco. And the story NPS tells to the public over and over again is very different. A simplistic tale of ancestral pueblos with only minor incidental ties to Mesoamerica, and none of the advanced social experiment you allude to here. You have written so many scholarly works written for other archaeologists, but nothing for John Q. Public yet. When will the Steve Lekson John Q. Public interpretation of Chaco history be written? It is badly needed.
I know who this is. Well, thank you. But the history of the ancient Southwest, can't remember when that came out, 2009, something like that. It has a lot of this stuff in it, and it's not exactly a bestseller. It was a bestseller for SAR Press, let's put it that way. And there's a lot of people who aren't archaeologists who read it. That's about as close as I got, about as close as I'm going to get to writing well, it's not a mass market thing. I think it's sold like 6,000 copies or something like that.
Well, with that last comment, I'm going to try to hide my T-shirt, which is NPS.
Well, the Park Service, the Park Service has several audiences that it has to satisfy, and among those are certainly the Pueblo people, and they walk a tight line between the Pueblos and the Navajos, because Navajos, they know what Chaco was, and they're perfectly willing to talk about it. And the Pueblo people, I think, know what Chaco was too. They don't want to talk about it. It's like the ceremony of forgetting. Remember that we know all about Chaco, but we don't talk about it because bad things happened there. And I don't think the Pueblo people are comfortable with the ugly stuff at Chaco, which would include nobles, coming to the top of the mix. I mean, you get these anodyne Pueblo accounts, and I'm thinking this is one from Hopi where several of the clans lived there, and they planted corn and they did ceremonies, and it was time for them to leave, and they left. That's the Pueblo account. But from that same guy, a guy that was a friend and a very knowledgeable Hopi, important guy in the Hopi government, wrote an article about Wapaki, which is over near Flagstaff, where he says Wapaki was where the leadership got together because the previous way of life, and Wapaki comes right after Chaco. I should note this, that Wapaki happens right after Chaco, and it's full of very interesting things that remind one of Chaco, where the leadership gets together to hammer out a new way of living, the Hopi way, that it repudiates the previous system, which was not right. And I think, that's as close as I've heard from an admission from Hopi anyway, that Chaco was something different. But anyway, the Park Service has to, satisfy those guys too. And it is in their history. I'm not, again, I don't think there's any of the nobles still around to speak up and say, we want to be represented too. They're all gone, but it's their history and it's their heritage. Let's put it that way. It's their heritage. And I present this version of Chaco. I'm doing this for a while now. And in some audiences, and this happened more than once, this happened more than 3 times actually. Some Pueblo person would come up after I talked and they said, "You're not right, you're getting pretty close, and we don't want our kids to hear it from you." And it's one of the reasons I retired. I mean, what do you do with that? They need to tell their kids what they want their kids to hear.
Okay, well, now here's a summary comment, and there's several of these, but it's a thank you for a very informative and interesting presentation, Dr. Lekson, and that would be a summary from several other people as well. I'm hoping that the 100 or so computers that signed on tonight had a good time. Well, there's actually one more Q&A here. Let's see. Well, oh, okay. Again, here's the anonymous attendee. Aren't we mostly obligated to an accurate rendition of history and deserving of it, regardless of who comes out on top?
As an archaeologist who wants to be a historian, I would say yes. That's what I'm supposed to do. That's what we get paid to do, is figure out what happened. The public interface there, though, is murky. I mean, you have peoples who are very deeply engaged and historically connected to these places who wish very strongly to have a say in how they are interpreted. And I think the Park Service, I think, again, I know who I'm talking to here, that the Park Service has an obligation to those folks too. When I was at the Museum in New Mexico, we tried to present parallel narratives. Here's what you learn from the archaeology, the way that we practice archaeology around the world. Archaeology is not a particular plague visited on Southwestern Indians. It's a global enterprise. Okay, here's what we learned from the archaeology, and then not talk to Pueblo people and interpret for them, but get people that are willing to write their version of it and share that version. And usually the shared version, not with the Navajos, but the shared version is very careful and not stepping on anybody's toes, as it were. I mean, it's very generic's the wrong word, but it doesn't go into those kinds of specifics, because remember the ceremony of forgetting. Not everybody's supposed to know this stuff. So yeah, I mean, I sympathize with the Park Service having to deal with both of those issues. They kind of lean way more heavily towards the Native American, especially, well, in Chaco is both Pueblo and Navajo, but the Native American take on this, which we've had the archaeology take for decades and decades and decades, and maybe it's about time to get the other side.
Okay, well, good. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. again, on behalf of the 100 computers, and I say 100 computers because oftentimes there are more than, one person looking at that computer. So there's probably more than 100 people. But on behalf of them, I certainly would like to thank you. And I would also like to thank the people that showed up. I mean, you're our audience, and I'm very appreciative that you guys are able to do it. I want to remind you of Al's dancing hat for donations. The link to that site is on the chat page as well. And Doctor, do you have any last thoughts you might want to put out there by chance?
You asking me?
Yes.
Yeah, give Old Pueblo money. It's a good organization.
Thank you.
Write them a check.
That's a good one.
They do good work.
The paid political announcement there. Okay, well, I guess, Alan, do you have any thoughts as well?
No, I'd also like to thank Steve and those of you who are watching tonight. I think this is a really good presentation and kind of makes you think about things in different ways than you normally get the archaeology story about.
And again, this program has been recorded, and at some point in maybe in the next day or so, it'll be on Old Pueblo's YouTube channel. So, and again, thanks Al. He's not only is he our executive director, but he's also a good guy. So, thank you guys. Good night from us anyway.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Butch. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.